Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. I'm Spencer Simpson.
And I'm Kelton Howell. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining us on this channel. We have been having so much fun. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our weekly Magic the Gathering content. This week, we're going to be talking about evaluating Magic cards for Commander. And this is something that's really difficult, I think, kind of no matter what stage you're at in the game.
Yeah, Magic players are famously not very good at this. You can see it if you hop into any Reddit thread talking about new releasing cards. There would be people on either side of the line talking about whether cards can be really good or really bad. Like me hopping into a thread about the One Ring and saying that it was basically Ancient Craving with upside, which was objectively very wrong.
Didn't withstand the test of time on that one.
No, it did not. Nope, that was bad.
I think it's really fun, too, to listen to people who are, professionals in this game. If you look at Luis Scott Vargas, I always enjoy listening to the Limited Resources set reviews every time a new set comes out. And LSV is very good at evaluating Magic cards. He's been playing for a long time. He's a Pro Tour player, a Hall of Famer. And even he gets cards wrong sometimes. And he has an encyclopedic knowledge of the cards in the game and can easily compare them to cards that were good in the past to know how good they're going to be. Occasionally, though, he misses. And so don't feel too bad if you have a difficult time telling if a new card is going to be good or not.
Yeah, can I talk about one time that I felt like Luis Scott Vargas missed and I paid the price?
Yes, tell me about it.
So it was at the Dominaria United pre-release, and that was my first pre-release where I was listening to Limited Resources trying to get the scoop on what cards would be good, and they'd mentioned Destroy Evil, which was 1 and a white for an instant. Choose one, destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, or destroy target enchantment. And then they were like, this will probably be okay. Ended up being a format all-star for Limited because of the number of creatures that had toughness 4 or greater and the number of enchantments that were doing really well relevant in the format. Yep. I pulled 2 of these, or maybe 3 in my pre-release, and I sideboarded them because they talked about them being sideboard cards. And,
that is a tough one. And I have to say, Limited Resources is absolutely the best podcast for Limited.
Oh, they do a phenomenal job. But
so
that's just
but
to put a fine point on it,
This is such a good example. Yeah, this is such a good example of a card that is difficult to evaluate without the broader context of the format. Because this card, though it was really good in that format, would not be good in other sets. It's not like this template of a card is not always good. It's only sometimes good. And it's so heavily dependent on the context of the set.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So, what makes it difficult, Kelton? We're talking about evaluating Magic cards. People are bad at it. What makes it so hard?
Yeah, so I think it's just that it's hard to judge anything without the additional context. And sometimes the additional context can actually confuse things more. So it's difficult to know when to take the context and when to leave the context. So an example of this is EDHREC. It's such a powerful database to look at inclusions for decks. So you look up a commander, you see all the cards that people like to play in that deck. And sometimes that's a good thing because it can show you cards that you might have missed. And sometimes it's a bad thing. Sometimes people play a large in a large percentage of decks, a card that does not belong in the deck and isn't quite good.
Yeah, I think an example of this is I was working on an elf deck. It was a Golgari elf deck, and the commander's the most famous commander, and I can't think of her name right now.
Lathril.
Blade of the Elves. Yes, let me read Lathril really quick. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Lathril, Blade of the Elves, 2 green, black for a 2/3. Elf Noble with Menace, and whenever Lathril, Blade of the Elves, deals combat damage to a player, create that many 1/1 green elf warrior creature tokens. And then you can tap Lathril and tap 10 untapped elves you control, and each opponent loses 10 life, and you gain 10 life.
Yeah.
So I was looking through this deck list. This was a precon from Kaldheim.
Yeah. Something. It was from Kaldheim time period. I don't remember if it was it wasn't. I don't think it was the Kaldheim deck.
I think it was the Commander series, the Commander set from that year.
Yeah, because AC was the other one.
Exactly. Yeah. So it was from the Commander set from that year, and I think, especially commanders that become popular that are in precons, get a little bit polluted by the cards that are included in the deck, and people just uploading their deck list with all of the precon cards.
Yes.
So one of the cards in there was Shaman of the Pack. which is, let me pull it up here, Shaman of the Pack, is 1 black-green for a 3/2 elf shaman. So it's an elf, so it's relevant for the deck. But it says when Shaman of the Pack enters the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to the number of elves you control, which is not enough impact for me to want to include that in my deck. And so I've had it in my deck list, and I was looking through my deck list, and I was like, why is this in here? Like, I don't think this is doing anything for my deck that I'm, like, trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So that's a really good example of how the context can actually confuse your evaluation of a card. So Joey from EDH Retcast did a really awesome episode on the context that impact card evaluation. I highly recommend watching that episode. I'll go ahead and post it in the notes of the show. But he went over some of the contextual factors that can cause us to over or under evaluate cards. So things like the context of a specific strategy. So you may sit down with your pod and play against someone who plays Rooftop Storm in a zombie deck. So Rooftop Storm is a 6-mana enchantment, 5 and a blue, for an enchantment. And you may pay 0 rather than pay the mana cost for zombie creature spells you cast. Quite frequently in a zombie deck, this is just one of the best cards in the deck. It's going to allow someone to just dump their whole hand and really accelerate themselves so far ahead in the game. And you may sit at that game, at that table, and see how that card performs and be like, oh my goodness, this card is so good. I have a deck that has a zombie sub-theme. I should put that card in the deck. It's not going to do the same thing.
No, this definitely belongs in a deck that is explicitly zombies in the main theme. Because if you draw a Rooftop Storm and have a zombie in hand, like, sure.
The zombie's going to cost less than a Rooftop Storm.
It's exactly. It's most of the time going to cost less than Rooftop Storm. And so you're not going to be able to dump your hand. And it is only good contextually in that type of deck. So you want to make sure that you're reading those signals. One you have listed here is Evolving Wilds versus Escape Tunnel, which I'm not familiar with Escape Tunnel.
Yeah, so Joey talked about how existing staples can actually cause people to ignore new cards that are printed. So Evolving Wilds, such a popular commander card. It's printed in so many pre-con decks. People include it in so many different decks. Evolving Wilds is a land that you can tap and sacrifice to search your library for a basic land card and then put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then you shuffle your deck. So this is a very generic, common commander card. From Murders at Karlov Manor, Escape Tunnel is a land that has tap, sacrifice, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. It also has, as an ability, tap, sacrifice, Escape Tunnel. Target creature with power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn.
Interesting.
It's strictly better Evolving Wilds. It's Evolving Wilds with additional text on it. So there's no reason why a deck should be running Evolving Wilds over Escape Tunnel. If you want both of them, that's fine. But why would you want Evolving Wilds and not just want Escape Tunnel, even if the fringe benefit of making a creature with power 2 or less unblockable comes up once in every 100 games? That's still relevant in 1 out of 100 games. And it's just because Evolving Wilds is so prevalent. It's not like Wizards is going to start printing Escape Tunnel in precons in place of Evolving Wilds. Every precon is still going to have Evolving Wilds.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I was sitting here thinking, when would I ever use the second part of Escape Tunnel? And then also, why does that matter? Because it has that ability, and I can use it once in 100. I was thinking the exact same number. Yeah. You use this once in 100 games. It's not. It's all gravy at that point, right?
Yep. So that's an interesting thought. The other thing that can really confuse context that Joey talks about is the set or the precon that they're released in. So I think a really good example of this is Monologue Tax. So Monologue Tax is 2 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token. And when this was printed, people started comparing it to Smothering Tithe, which is 3 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a treasure token. People are like, oh, it's this thing that's going to generate me so many treasures when my opponents just do stuff that they're naturally doing in the game. Because drawing cards and double spelling in a turn are just things that your opponents are going to be doing. It does not play anything like Smothering Tithe.
No, yeah. Each time you draw a card versus the second spell they cast is a very different timing for this to happen.
Yeah. And so I think people were disappointed in it because it wasn't Smothering Tithe. And if you look at the deck that it was included in, which I believe is Oskia the Reconstructor, would you read this card? Because you're building this deck right now, right?
Yeah, I am. I'm a little on the fence if I'm going to build it, but I have been working on it. I've got several that I'm working on right now that I'm trying to figure out which one to brew. Oskia the Reconstructor is 2 red-white for a 4/4 legendary creature giant artificer. He has vigilance, and you can pay 1 and sacrifice an artifact, and target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So it's just a sack outlet for artifacts. And he has you pay X, tap him, and exile an artifact card with mana value X from your graveyard. X being the amount you paid as part of the cost of the spell. Create 2 tokens that are copies of the exiled card. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is like an artifact matters deck, and you are trying to get artifacts in your graveyard and then reanimate copies of them.
Yeah, so Monologue Tax doesn't fit really into the theme of this deck. It does very little. It creates you treasures, which is good in every commander deck, but doesn't do anything that would make it stand out in this deck. Whereas I think if it had been printed in a deck like Marneus Calgar, people would have been a lot higher on it. So I think, and I'll read Marneus Calgar. So 2 white, blue, black for a 3/5 legendary creature, Astartes warrior. I butchered that pronunciation, I'm sure. Sorry, Warhammer friends. For a creature with double strike, whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under your control, you draw a card, and then it has the activated ability pay 6 whenever, or create 2/2/2 white warrior creature tokens with vigilance. So I think if Monologue Tax had been printed in something like this, where it cares about creating tokens and it draws you cards when you create tokens, all of a sudden that card looks a lot better in the context of this deck. And so I think the context of the deck it was printed in made it both over-evaluated because people just saw it and thought it was Smothering Tithe because like it's just a generic value piece in that deck, and under-evaluated because then everybody hated Monologue Tax and no one played it when it does belong in some decks and it's very good.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask because you said people would rate it higher, but we just been talking about how people overrated it. But contextually, it was overrated as like as you said, as a value piece. I like the way you phrase that. Because it is good in the right context.
Yeah.
But it's not as good as Smothering Tithe generally in all white decks. And then the other thing you would talk about here, and forgive me, I'm pinging it all back to you because I didn't read this article. But it's cards from Aftermath or Infinity. But I recognize this one because I don't play cards from Aftermath or Infinity very much.
Yeah, so that's another way in which the context of a set can cause people to not evaluate cards correctly. Aftermath was considered, I think, a flop. Definitely considered a flop. And Infinity, as far as I know, was also considered a flop. I quite liked Infinity, but I know a lot of people didn't like Infinity. And so there are playable cards in Aftermath and Infinity that do not see play because the sets were considered poor sets. When there are cards that, like, one of my favorite cards, one of my pet cards, actually comes from Infinity. It's Exchange of Words. I think this is an incredibly fun card to play.
This one's so silly.
I know, but it's a card that you can play in Commander, and I think can see play in Commander very reasonably. It's 1 blue for an enchantment. When Exchange of Words enters the battlefield, you choose 2 target creatures. For as long as Exchange of Words remains on the battlefield, exchange the text boxes of those creatures. It's a silly effect. It doesn't always hit, but I've also won games with this card.
Yeah, you stole my Toxrill one time by turning my Toxrill into a vanilla 1/1 or something. And making your token into a Toxrill effect. Yeah, so it's pretty crazy.
I think this is a really fun card, super playable, adds a lot of flavor to a game. But, I mean, it doesn't see play. If I went onto EDHREC right now, it's in 0% of eligible decks. It's only in 6,000 decks. So it's crazy. Yep. So that's another thing that can affect how people contextualize cards.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same way about like Streets of New Capenna. We've talked about this several times. That like I don't know if it was a flop necessarily from Wizards of the Coast standpoint, and I think it was like generally well liked. But from my perspective, I don't play a lot of New Capenna cards because I undervalue the set, and I think there are lots of cards from it that people should play more.
I mean, that's a running joke on the Command Zone, right? Is they say if it's a card that you don't recognize, it's from Streets of New Capenna Commander.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I didn't know that. That's hilarious.
Yeah. So it's very interesting. You should look into some of those sets that you may not regularly play to see if they're playable cards that you might enjoy playing.
Because there likely are. Like, New Capenna had a bunch of bombs in it that people should play that they don't play enough.
Yeah, the card designers at Wizards of the Coast work very hard to make cool cards. So there's not going to be any set that doesn't have playable cards. Like, there are even a small set like Aftermath. One of the ones that I think people should look at is, I think it's called Leyline Immersion. So I'm going to pull it up right now and read it. Yeah, it's 3 and a green for an enchantment aura. You enchant a legendary creature, and then the enchanted creature has Ward 2, and tap, add 5 mana in any combination of colors, and spend this mana only to cast spells.
Okay.
That's a cool card. It's got protection and ramp and color fixing all on the same card,
That's pretty cool.
which is pretty cool. Yeah.
I will say, having played Bear Umbra, cards like this scare me because trying to enchant something and then having it removed in response to being
Out from
enchanted.
under it?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. Pretty rough.
Yeah, I think that's some recency bias because I removed
I think it is some recency bias, but also you better believe Bear Umbra's coming out of that deck probably.
So funny. I
So,
love it.
with those challenges in mind, we're going to be talking about how we can be better at evaluating Magic cards in Commander, starting with comparing to existing cards. And I think this is probably the best starting point for evaluating cards because every other card has already been evaluated. So if you can find a card that is similar to one that already exists, even if it's in a different context, you can get some idea for, like, and sometimes it doesn't work. Like we just talked about, the one I was just talking about
Mono
earlier,
attacks and
or
some
Destroy
other
Evil.
type.
Destroy Evil.
Destroy Evil, sure.
Right? Tons of cards similar to that have been printed, and they were evaluated as about mid, and it was very good in that set. So sometimes the context can change it, but for the most part, comparing to an existing card can give you a really great starting place for getting a solid evaluation of a card that you've not seen before.
Yeah, so you want to ask yourself things like, how does the cost of the card compare? And the cost can be mana cost. It can also be like setup cost, both in deck building and in game. How does the effect compare? Do we play the existing card already? So Destroy Evil, in a limited sense, we kind of know where that falls. But in Commander, do we play Destroy Evil? I actually really like playing Destroy Evil in Budget Commander in really lower power games.
Yeah.
I think it's really quite good. But in a lot of higher power games, that's not a card that is played.
No, yeah, when you have Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, which would be things you would
So much
compare it
better.
to,
Yeah.
it's 1 mana more and way more narrow, right?
Yep. And then you can ask yourself, when would we want to play the new card over the existing card? So, more and more, though, to keep in mind, is we're just getting cards that are just strictly better versions of the previous cards. We've already talked about Evolving Wilds and Escape Tunnel. So sometimes these comparisons can be pretty easy, and it's not hard to evaluate.
Yeah, it just takes the same text of the previous card and appends something to it. Like an example here is Mana War and Aether Channeler. So Mana War is the old card. We're going to talk about the old card and then the new card. So Mana War is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 creature jellyfish. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature to its owner's hand. And Aether Channeler is 2 and a blue for a 2/1, so it's got 1 less toughness. And it says, when Aether Channeler enters the battlefield, choose 1. Create a 1/1 bird creature token with flying. Return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, or draw a card. So
Now,
not
I
only
will
can it
say, the Aether Channeler is a human wizard, so you do lose the highly relevant creature type of jellyfish.
true. Big downside, big L for Aether Channeler.
Yeah, this
it's
card's
also
so much better.
two relevant creature types, by the
Yeah,
way.
I
Yeah,
know.
that's huge. And it's... I will say it is another non-land permanent, so it can't bounce itself. I don't know how that's ever relevant with
Yeah,
Mana War.
I don't think I've ever played Mana War to bounce itself,
Like,
but I
if
guess
it,
you totally could.
Yeah, you could probably
like
loop
dramatic
it
reversal,
somehow.
infinite
Yeah,
mana.
I don't know.
Yeah,
If there was
I
like a
don't know.
loop thing you could do. But with Aether Channeler, it's hitting non-land permanents, which is just significantly better than only hitting creatures, and then also maybe creating new tokens or drawing you a card. It is strictly better because it has the Mana War text with some stuff able to it. And I think
Yeah.
this next one is an even more clear example of something. It's just like,
Oh yeah,
Actually
this is
strictly
crazy,
better.
and a very recent one. So the first card is Fervor. So 2 and a red for an enchantment. Creatures you control have haste. This card is still pretty expensive. It's like $4 or $5.
I bought one for $4, and it was when this other card was printed at Uncommon, by the way. I was
Yes.
like, what the heck?
Fervor's rare, and then recently we got Rising of the Day, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment at uncommon. Creatures you control have haste. Legendary creatures you control get +1/+0. So why not just staple another line of text onto this?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's 32 cents.
Yeah, if you have Fervor in any of your decks, immediately take it out and put in Rising of the Day. This
Yeah.
is the most clean-cut example of something that is just like strictly better and playable in Commander, right?
And
like
super playable.
they do a lot of
Fervor
strictly
probably
better.
has the price it does because a lot of decks just want every version of this effect that they can get, and so they're going to be running both Rising of the Day and Fervor.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that in the car today or yesterday, and I don't know that that's true. Like, I think there are some people that think they want every version of this effect in their deck, but it's not like an Anthem. Like, they don't stack. Like, you don't get double haste.
No, but I mean, I do have decks where for a combo, haste matters, and so I'm running multiple haste enablers.
Sure, I think that's
It's
fair.
narrow.
I think there are enough haste enablers that also do different things that you probably don't need both Fervor and Rising of the Day.
And Rising of the Day is just better.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
So those are some examples of some pretty clear-cut cards that are just strictly better versions, but it's not always that easy. So there are some recent cards that got printed. So this example is Blood Artist as the original card, which is 1 in a black for a 0/1 vampire that whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is a very common effect that we see in Commander. It's really important in Aristocrats decks and in several combo decks. Vein Ripper is 3 black, black, black for a 6/5 vampire assassin with flying. It has Ward, sacrifice a creature, and whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is like a bunch of Blood Artists stapled together.
Yeah, it is. It's like it's 3 Blood Artists stapled together in cost, but they only lose 2 life and you gain 2 life.
It is a 6/5 flyer.
Yeah, it's big, and it has Ward.
It has Ward, sacrifice a creature.
So it's guaranteed to go once, right? It's guaranteed
Yeah.
to trigger once, basically. And okay, so I was thinking about this one also, and I don't know how I didn't think, oh, I better pick one of these up when it's $7. It's now like $20.
Yeah.
Because at one point, Blood Artist was like $5 or $6, and then it got reprinted a ton, and it's still like $2.
Yeah.
And this is like triple Blood Artist, right? And it's mythic, so I totally should have picked these one.
But at first glance, you're also like, it's 6 mana, it's got 3 black pips, it's kind of hard to cast.
That's what I'm saying, right? Is
Yeah.
it does feel like it feels pretty mana intensive. And so I was like, oh, this won't be that good. And I think it is only really expensive right now because of the play season Pioneer. I think it's a Pioneer Vampires deck or Explorer.
I know there's a
can't remember.
constructed format.
Yeah,
that's
there's a
playing this
format
card
where
a
it is
lot.
played pretty heavily.
Yeah, and part of me is curious because Blood Artist, I think, has a place in combo decks and also just Aristocrat decks. And in combo decks, you don't really care if it's 1 or 2 life because you're going to loop something and it's going to kill everybody.
Right.
But also, people just die to Blood Artist just after a board wipe or something.
Oh.
And this kills people twice as fast in that fashion.
It's crazy. Blood Artist is one that I often like put in decks that are going to be like even have some sort of Aristocrats sub theme, and then I take it out. I just mumbled that so hard. Aristocrats sub theme, but but I should like. I'm always surprised with how well Blood Artist does because it's triggering off of any creature. I think it's easy to read it as like, oh, when my creatures die, this happens. But there's 3 other players, and they might have like 3 to 5 creatures, right?
The same thing happens with Sir Conrad. I'm always surprised by how much work Sir Conrad does when he's on the battlefield.
Yep, it's crazy.
Yeah, do you want to read the next example?
Yes, I will. This one, I think, also is pretty similar in that it does more work than you expect it to.
Yeah.
And it is Marionette Master. Marionette Master is 4 black, black for a 1/3 human artificer with Fabricate 3. And he says, Fabricate 3, just for Fabricate, for a reminder for everybody. It says, when this creature enters the battlefield, put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, or create 3 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. So you can either make it bigger or make more creatures. And then it says, whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. This, against treasures...
Yeah.
This
scary.
is crazy.
Every time you sack a treasure, then someone loses 4 life.
Yeah, or anytime anyone sacks a treasure, it's a graveyard.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's really, really good. It's such a good card. But we're talking about evaluating cards here. Sorry, I'm getting excited about some of my pet cards. This is Marionette Master. The card that was just printed in the most recent set, Modern Horizons 3, at the time of this recording, is Marionette Apprentice, which is 1 in a black for a 1/2 human artificer with Fabricate 1. We just read Fabricate. It enters with a +1/+1 counter or creates a 1/1 colorless servo. And whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life.
Yeah, this is the inverse of what happened with Blood Artist and Vein Ripper, where we went from the little one to the big one, and we were like, okay, is the big one good enough to justify the cost? And now we're going from the big one to the little one. We're like, okay, is the little one good enough to justify being a cheaper version of this spell?
Yeah, well, for this one, I think yes. But also, it is hard to judge because Marionette Master, the difference between 4 damage and 1 damage. And no, this is 1 because it's only 1 life. It doesn't grow
Oh,
with
it
its power.
doesn't. It's not even the same ability. So it's 4-1
Yeah, and it's only
Yeah.
creature or artifact you
that
control.
you control, but it is also creature.
But it is also creature.
So it does a blood artist impressive.
Exactly. So
impression,
you can see where it gets difficult to evaluate
Yeah.
cards because this is not a 1-for-1 comparison with Marionette Master.
Yep.
But it's like close.
Yeah, I mean it's still like if you're the treasure deck, it's still doing a lot of work.
Yeah, well, this is definitely going in my Shirei deck.
Yeah, and it's probably going in my Prosper deck.
Right. It's a really great card for like to be able to get sacrifice triggers and make creatures or get damage off of stuff dying. But it's not Marionette Master. But I think it's still pretty good. I think it belongs in decks that wants a smaller version of Marionette Master. But it is hard to evaluate, and we'll have to see how it. Probably have to play test it to see how it does.
Yep. The next way that the next method that we can use to evaluate Magic cards, especially for Commander, is just considering the cost versus the impact. So sometimes we don't have something straight across to compare a card to, but we can try and understand the rate or the efficiency of the card for what it's trying to accomplish. So we can likely do some sort of comparison of it's not exactly this, but it's the same. It's a similar effect.
Yeah, so when you think about like the rate or an efficiency of a card, it's really helpful to think about like the inputs versus the outputs, or like the cost and the benefit of a card. So the cost of a card is most often like how much mana are you spending on it? Are you spending life on it? Are you spending cards? Right, you discarding cards for it, and you can even get like a little like cost can get a little bit complicated because it might cost stuff over multiple turns. Like you might have a cumulative upkeep, or it might require a lot of setup. And I think setup is the often overlooked cost of a card, and what causes people to overevaluate cards. I think pretty frequently, right, including myself.
Definitely. And in that setup, like we said earlier, can be in the game. Like you actually have to have things on board or in hand in order for that card to be good. Or as part of your deck building. So Rooftop Storm, like we talked about earlier, has a huge setup cost where you have to be running a critical mass of zombies. Like you need to be running like 35, 40 zombies in order for that card to be good.
Yeah, absolutely. And some cards have more setup cost than others. But I think generally speaking, like setup cost is setting up before in game, like setting up a board state, really accelerates your cost even more than mana sometimes. Like if I have a card that costs 5 mana that requires a board state setup, like for example, let's talk about Return of the Wild Speaker, or an even better version would be like Shamanic Revelation. Let's do Shamanic Revelation.
Yeah. So this card is 3 green for a sorcery. You draw a card for each creature you control, and then you gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. So you have to have a lot of creatures before you cast the spell in order to get the benefit of it.
Right, exactly. Now if we compare to something like Peer into the Abyss, right, which is 2 more mana. It's 4 black, so a little more mana intensive, right? 1 more pip, 1 more colorless. Target player draws cards equal to half the number of cards in their library and loses half their life, round up each time.
Yep.
Like, this is
no setup cost.
No setup cost, right?
Besides having like more than like 10 cards in your library.
Right, exactly, sure, right. Which, starting at 100 is not particularly difficult.
Yeah.
But I would say, from a cost-benefit analysis, I mean, and it costs half your life. Don't forget that. It costs half your life, which is a lot. But, like, in a cost-benefit analysis here, the setup cost for Shamanic Revelation makes me value it significantly less as a draw spell than Peer into the Abyss, even though it costs 2 more mana, because the benefit is just, like, far greater.
Yep, exactly. So once you think about what the cost is, then think about what kind of effect does it produce. So does it produce mana? Does it produce card advantage? Is it interaction with the board? Does it create other kinds of resources, or just even rectangles? Is it creating some kind of tokens? And so once you know the cost, once you know the effect that it's producing, how do we feel about that rate? The better that we feel about the returns on our investment, the higher we likely are to evaluate the card.
Yeah, so for card draw, we generally consider, like, as an example, we consider 1 mana per card as, like, a pretty good rate for card advantage.
Yeah.
And honestly, I feel like this is how I felt a couple years ago, potentially. I don't. I think this is probably like the bare minimum I want to be playing for the most part.
Sure.
Like this is.
We play
I feel
Night's
like,
Whisper. We don't play Divination.
right, exactly. I feel like this used to be like, oh, this is like the best. The best cards do this, and I think now it's like if you're putting a card in your deck, it better be doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
At least 1 card per mana. Yeah.
Yeah, right. For the most part, like again with stuff like Shamanic Revelation, you might draw 3 or 4, but that's like getting pretty close, right?
Sure.
And so it's getting. I think as cards are just getting better, I think that's moving away. But that's a good example of like how we determine a rate and how we feel about it, right? So that's kind of what the consensus has been for card advantage.
Yep. And generally, as the cost goes up, you're also hoping to just see a bigger payout. So you gave the example of Puritan the Best. If you're going to pay 7 mana, you do want more than 7 cards.
Yeah. You want 1 mana per card until there's got to be some like critical mass, right?
Yeah.
Where I'm like, okay, I better be getting more than the mana I'm paying for these cards because I want to draw 10 cards and I don't want to pay 10 mana to do that.
Yep, exactly. There's another really fun method that you can use to evaluate cards. This one is used more in Limited, but I think also can be very helpful in Commander, and that's quadrant theory. So this is something that was created by Brian Wong at the time when I believe he was a co-host on Limited Resources. So this is judging a card against 4 different quadrants of game states. So the first is when the game is developing. So this is like early in the game as everybody's kind of building. When you're ahead, when you're at parity, and when you're behind. And so those are the 4 quadrants. And if a card performs well in multiple quadrants, then it's a more effective and efficient card.
Yeah, and this could be, I think, one of the hardest parts of a card to evaluate because it can be really easy to imagine what a card can do in like a magical Christmas land.
Yep.
Where it's like everything is perfect, the setup is perfect, you have everything the way you need it to, and it like for a
You
card draw
have
spell,
those 3 black pips to cast Peer into the Abyss
right,
every
and
time.
it draws you your entire deck, and then you
Yeah.
have Sheoldred out, and so you're gaining the life back.
Yeah.
Like it's really easy to imagine like the top end of that. But the average, like, and it's easy to think that that's the average, right? I think that's the problem, is you imagine the Christmas land, and then you pull it down and perceive it as the average, when really that's like the ceiling of what the card can do.
Yeah, you also have to think of the floor. So there's the floor, the ceiling, and the average. And you need to recognize all 3 of those and how those are going to play in those 4 quadrants. And you came up with a few different instances of an effect and applied, kind of that baseline effect to each of those and looked at them in quadrant theory. Do you want to read those off to us?
Yeah, so it is 3 cards. It is I'll read them and then I'll describe them. So it's Sheoldred, Whispering One, Virtue of Persistence and Lockthwain Scorn, and Debtor's Knell. And we've talked about some of these cards previously in previous episodes, but I feel like they were a really good example of how we can try to evaluate quadrant theory.
Yep. Yeah, so Sheoldred Whispering One is 5 black for a legendary creature praetor. It's 6/6. It has Swamp Walk, which I always forget. Why does it need Swamp Walk? At the beginning of your upkeep, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, and at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature.
Yep. And
Yeah,
then
so
here-
this
should,
is...
should we talk about this one? Do you want to talk about this one first, or do you want to read all the cards?
Let's read through all of them. Go ahead and read Virtue of Persistence.
The next one is Virtue of Persistence. It's 5 black, so same mana cost, for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So it says a graveyard, which is really good. And then it has an adventure called Lockthwain Scorn, which is 1 and a black for a sorcery adventure. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. You gain 2 life.
Yeah, so a little bit of added flexibility there. So what's interesting is, like, in comparison to Sheoldred has removal and reanimation, and Lockthwain Scorn also has the removal portion to Virtue of Persistence's reanimation. And then the last one is Debtor's Knell. So this is 4 and then 3 Hybrid Orzhov mana. So 7 mana total for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So this is the other half of Virtue of Persistence.
Yep. A couple more pips. We've talked about the comparison of these before, but I think it is a worthwhile exercise to go through and try to evaluate some quadrant theory here. And we talked about needing to know the floor, the average, and the ceiling. I think the most important two to know are like the floor and the average, right? Like, because that's most often what's going to happen. And if you get the ceiling, then you're like just the happiest person on earth, right?
Sure. Yeah, you should be planning for the ceiling of the card.
Right, exactly. So you talked about there being removal on some of these. So I think with Shieldred, the baseline is that you have a 6/6 on board, right?
Yep.
And that potentially the next opponent, like the worst this could possibly do is you get a 6/6, the next opponent doesn't have a creature or has tokens, and then it gets like removed at their end step or something, right?
Sure, a 6/6 was Swamp Walk.
Right, very big creature. So it draws removal, right?
Yep.
Like that's the... Like, the floor, I think it's hard. I don't know if this is the correct way to evaluate the floor, but I always imagine the floor of like, okay, this is the board, and then it gets removed. What do I do?
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
And then the average would be like, oh, you have 6/6 on board, and then the next three opponents maybe sacrifice a creature, and then it gets removed before your turn, so you can't reanimate anything.
Yeah, so on average, you're at least having a big thing that draws removal, and you're removing some of your opponent's creatures.
Right.
And then Virtue of Persistence, Locthwain Scorn. So the floor on this one is a little different. You get to remove something, targeted removal, you give something -3/-3, and then you gain the 2 life. And then maybe you never really get to play the big second half of that. Maybe you don't get enough mana. Maybe, something bad happens. But on average...
Or you play it and it doesn't make it to your turn, right?
Sure.
Because it has to... It triggers at your upkeep, right?
But I do think that on average, it probably kills a smaller creature and then you get to reanimate a creature. At least one.
Yeah. And from any graveyard, too, which is pretty good.
It is good. Not for that much mana. It's 9 mana to do both of those things. But...
Right.
So you're really hoping to get a lot more creatures off of it, but I'd say it's the average.
Yeah, for sure. And then Debtor's Knell, the baseline would be like, you play it, and then it gets removed before your turn, right? Like, there's no upside to this outside of waiting till it gets to your turn. And then, the average is maybe it gets a creature or two. The same as Virtue of Persistence. So it's easy to tell that Virtue of Persistence is just like clearly better than Debtor's Knell. Like, if you're going to play Debtor's Knell, you should play Virtue of Persistence. And then, right, if... budget aside, right? If you were to just like try to build the best deck possible, Virtue of Persistence is just like a better card, right? I think we can agree on that. And then it becomes kind of difficult, I think, the evaluation here.
Sure. Yeah, and if you look at quadrant theory, let's look at Shieldred. It's really good when you're ahead. Helps you slam the door. You have a giant creature that's pseudo unblockable. It's removing things. It's reanimating things. Really good at parity because then it's giving you something, taking things away from your opponents, and then giving you more stuff. And then you put most importantly is that it's probably pretty good when you're behind. It's gonna help re-level the playing field a little bit for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unless it gets removed, right? There's always that chance that happens. But like on average, you're hoping to get rid of some threats and maybe get another threat out on your board on your turn.
It doesn't do anything for you when you're developing though, because it's like a 7 mana creature.
No, because it's so expensive, right? You have this in your opening hand. You're like, okay, great. Well, I better reanimate this or hope I get till turn 7.
Yeah.
Whereas Virtue of Persistence, I think, also is pretty good in 3 of the categories. And 2 of them are the same, right? It's good when you're ahead, and it's good at parity, right?
Yep.
You are when you're ahead and you slam this down, people are like, oh my gosh, you already have a board state, and I have to deal with Virtue of Persistence. When you're at parity with somebody, same kind of deal, right? They're like, okay, well, everyone else is kind of doing stuff, and now we have to deal with Virtue of Persistence. But it's also good when you're developing because of that adventure, because you can...
Yeah, it's only 2 mana.
Right. You get to remove something that someone is playing early and then hold on to your Virtue of Persistence as an adventure for later. And what's kind of nice about that is it also dodges like any sort of being discarded or like you have Virtue of Persistence for the rest of the game if you need it.
Yeah, you can cast it from exile. It's awesome. I think it's also pretty good when you're behind just because you can remove something. And the effect of being able to get a creature from any graveyard is pretty good compared to Shieldred, but it's really difficult to compare which one is better, Shieldred or Virtue of Persistence. I would say I probably lean towards Virtue just because of how flexible the adventure mode is, but I think a argument can be made for either of them. But looking at Quadrant Theory, definitely puts Debtor's Knell as the worst version of this effect.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, it's only good from ahead and parity in the same way that those other 2 are, and it's just doing a worse job of it than the other 2 for the most part. Right, it's a better effect than Shieldred. I think that the A Graveyard is a better effect,
Sure.
generally speaking. But the fact that Shieldred's on a 6/6 Swamp Walk creature and makes people sacrifice creatures is pretty huge.
Yeah, because it does something before your next turn.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why I value Shieldred higher than Virtue of Persistence.
Sure.
It's just because it's for each opponent they have. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So these are all really great methods. Let's say that you find a card that you think is looking pretty cool. The next big hurdle that you have to face is you have to think about your deck. Like, how good is this card actually going to be in a deck? Because you might be saying, "Wow, Virtue of Persistence looks really cool. I want to play this card." And maybe you just don't have a deck that it really fits into. So how does the card support the strategy, the theme, and the power level of the deck that you're considering it for? And then you have to think about what card you would remove to make space for it.
Yeah, I think that can sometimes be the hardest part because you're not always removing a card that is filling the same role as that card, right? Often what happens for me is when I find a new card I want to include in a deck, I have like in my mind my 99th and 100th card already, and they probably are filling a different role. It could be that it's doing the same thing as this one, and this one's jumping way up the list, right? But often it's, I think, for example, like Bear Umbra is very good. I'm all of a sudden a little nervous with Bear Umbra in my deck, and it's fallen down my list, right?
Yeah.
And so there might be, if another card comes up that I think does the job better, then
it's on the chopping block.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but I like that you're thinking about it in terms of like the job for the card to do. So if I'm looking at Virtue of Persistence and I'm like, oh, it's a 2-mana removal spell, am I going to cut Baleful Mastery from my deck in order to put in Virtue of Persistence? Probably not. It doesn't do that job as well, and your deck would just be probably worse for it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you're not. I think in the same way that you don't want to just cut. Oh my goodness. What was I gonna say? I was thinking of like, I'm thinking of like MDFCs, right? Like I'm not gonna like. I think they do a good job of filling like multiple roles of like lands and like a spell.
Yeah,
but
because they are lands.
Because they are land. I am more likely to cut a land to have an extra MDFC than I am to cut a spell to have an extra MDFC.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And so I think in the same way that you're not cutting one of your better spells for this, like you need to make sure that it's
the role that it needs to be filling your deck is like the Virtue of Persistence side of it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the removal is what makes it good.
Yeah, it's like the extra benefit.
But when it comes down to it, really the best method for evaluating a Magic card is just playing the card. There's no substitute for testing the card out in your deck and doing it over and over and over again, playing with it a bunch of times.
Yeah, I read this article at one point. I 100% agree with this. I think also a caveat that I wanted to add here is that it's almost impossible to actually like truly evaluate a card and the effect of adding a single card to a Magic deck. I don't think it's impossible to evaluate a card. Rhystic Study is objectively very, very good and would improve any deck that it's in. That being said, I do think it's difficult to evaluate the effect of, like, you'd have to play tons, like, an unrealistic amount of games to actually, like, prove the effect of including a single card.
Totally.
Which is all to say, like, really what it comes down to is, like, you can evaluate the power of a card, but, like, play the cards you think are fun, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the final point, is, like, sparking joy. So the caveat for all of this is if you like a card, you should play it. This is a casual format, and you should do whatever brings you joy. And a casual format should afford you the opportunity to play casual cards and not feel bad about it.
I'm getting better at this.
Yeah.
It can be difficult, though. Like, I have wanted to play Mystic Confluence in a deck for a long time. And I think it's such a sweet card. I'm going to read Mystic Confluence because I think it's awesome.
It is a sweet card.
It's
super
cool
good and limited.
Yeah. It's 3 blue for an instant. Choose 3. You may choose the same mode more than once. Counter target spell unless the controller pays 3. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Draw a card.
Yeah.
So you can counter spell, return target 3 creatures, draw a card, like draw 3 cards. It's very, very flexible and I think quite good. I just haven't found a deck that I want to. I think it's a card that would spark joy for me to play.
Yeah, put it in any blue deck. It's good. It's fine in any blue deck.
I think it's
a good
great
card.
in a blue deck, but I just haven't. I haven't reached the point where I would probably play this in a Spellslinger deck, but I haven't felt I haven't put it in like just my zombie deck because I haven't had the courage to spark enough joy in myself to do it. But I think people should.
If I can make you feel any better about the card, just think about it in terms of, even though it's not the best rate for a counterspell, even though it's not the best rate for bounce spells, even though it's not the best rate for card draw, it does all three.
Yeah.
And so it's filling 3 roles in your deck, actually, which is pretty good.
It's pretty sweet. I think I maybe should play it. I think I underrate it, even though I think it's very cool.
That's your challenge for this episode. Pick a blue
Okay.
deck and put Mystic Confluence in it.
All right, can do.
So, Spencer and I are about to embarrass ourselves and practice evaluating some new cards. So we picked some cards from Modern Horizons 3 that we thought looked interesting. I think we picked 5 of them.
Yep.
We're going to evaluate these cards, and we might not do a great job at it because, as we established before, it's really hard to evaluate cards. But we are going to walk through the process and talk about the different methods and kind of workshop these and exercise these. So let us know what you think of these cards and if you think we evaluated them properly, and if they're cards that you think you're going to play in any of your decks.
Yes, and we, I think, made it a little bit easier on ourselves and picked monocolored cards. We picked one from each color,
Yeah.
which I think generally are a little bit easier because you can slot them into any deck that has that color, which is great. The
Yep.
first one here is Warren Soul Trader. So, and these are all from, Kelton, I think you mentioned all from Modern Horizons 3, right?
Yeah, and we haven't seen any of these played in Commander.
No.
Right? You have not seen any gameplay with any of these cards. I have not either.
No, I have not
Okay.
seen any gameplay with any of these cards. I watched a tiny bit of Modern Horizons 3 Limited, but that's
Yep.
also a very different format, and I didn't
Yep.
see any of these cards in there.
Okay,
So the first one
great.
here is Warren Soul Trader, which is 2 and a black for a 3/3 zombie goblin wizard at rare, and it has the ability pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, create a treasure token.
So my first impression of this card is that it has 3 relevant creature types, which is very, very interesting to me. And then this is a sacrifice outlet.
Yeah, a sacrifice outlet that creates treasures. So, what we want to do during this exercise is we want to use the tools we've been talking about to illustrate that maybe they can be helpful in evaluating cards. The first one here being looking at similar cards. And I think we can skip this first one. I don't think it's really that similar to a card, but Pitiless Plunderer is a very similar card, and
Yeah.
probably the closest comparison to this.
It was definitely the first card I thought of when I read this. I was like, oh, it's Pitiless Plunderer. So Pitiless Plunderer is 3 and a black for a 1/4 human pirate. Whenever another creature you control dies, you create a treasure token. So Warren Soul Trader is 1 less mana. It is, kind of a bigger bodied creature, which is pretty cool. But it is also the sacrifice outlet to get the treasure token, which is huge because all of the Pitiless Plunderer is very popular in combo lines, and those combo lines require a way to be able to sacrifice a creature to trigger Pitiless Plunderer. This does both, which is so good.
Yeah, it's the only thing that makes this card potentially not as good as Pitiless Plunderer is the fact that you have to pay life to activate the ability.
Yeah, so you can only do it so many times before you start to die.
Yeah, exactly. But that being said, any ability that lets you sacrifice a creature at will, even if you're paying a life, right, is generally considered very powerful. Like, that is an incredible... Yeah, it's very, very good. This is like... this is almost Phyrexian Arena in black. And even though you're paying life, I would argue that it's better because you get to...
Wait, what
store
card
the
did you
mana.
say? Phyrexian what?
Phyrexian Altar.
Okay, I thought you said arena. Did you say
I
arena?
did say arena.
Okay, I was like, what are you talking
I
about? I don't know
always
where
mix
this is
those
going.
up. Sorry, I always mix those up. Phyrexian
That's so
Altar.
funny. Yeah. Yep.
Yes, Phyrexian Altar, which, as a reminder, is 3 colorless for an artifact. Sacrifice a creature, add 1 mana of any color. So
Yep.
this is doing a similar thing on a relevant creature type. It is costing you 1 life. But creating a treasure versus just adding mana is almost always an upside, right? Because you can store those treasures for later, and you can have like potentially a big turn after. I think it's just a really, really good card.
Yeah. No, I think it is a really good card. So one thing to note is that we usually assess Pitiless Plunderer in terms of combo potential, right? Because the combo is you have Gravecrawler, which is a zombie that you can cast from your graveyard if you control a zombie, and then a way to sacrifice Gravecrawler. Then you get the treasure from Pitiless Plunderer, which you can use to cast Gravecrawler and do that infinitely. And then you have to have something on the battlefield that's like draining your opponents or dealing damage or something that's going to actually end the game as a combo. What's so cool? So for that one, you need it for that specific line. You would need Gravecrawler, Pitiless Plunderer, a Sacrifice Outlet, a Zombie, and you would need something that drains life. That's 5 cards. That's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
Warren Soul Trader is Warren Soul Trader, Gravecrawler, and something that drains.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it goes from a 4 card, and even with like Phyrexian Altar is another one that people use to do the same thing, right? It's a 3 card. It goes from that to a 3 almost basically a 2 card combo, except you do need something that drains life, right?
Yeah,
because it is a zombie itself.
Just loop. If you had like Kindred Discovery out or something, then you could just have Gravecrawler and Warren Soul Trader and just like pay a life, draw a card, pay a life, draw a card, pay a life, draw a card.
Yeah, exactly. Then it turns into a Yawgmoth Thran Physician.
Yeah,
right?
sweet.
It's a very good.
Did you mean Yawgmoth's Will? Or Yawgmoth's?
No, Yawgmoth Thran Physician in the sense that you're sacrificing a creature and drawing a card.
And drawing a card. Sure.
Right. Yawgmoth Thran Physician that also lets you cast Gravecrawler infinitely, right?
Yep.
So, that doesn't shrink people's creatures. So it's not quite Yawgmoth Thran Physician, but it's very good. I think it's I think the relevant creature types is what really pushes us over the edge for me.
Yep.
But it also, I think, belongs in any deck that is an Aristocrats deck, and I think can replace Pitiless Plunderer in a fair amount of them.
Yeah. So in terms of like, is this card good? If we look at it in quadrant theory, it's good when you're ahead, or I guess at parity because it's a combo card. It's not really that good outside of the combo. It can be fine. I guess you can sacrifice tokens to it to get treasures.
That's pretty good.
Which is pretty good. Or like you can block with something and sacrifice it for the treasure. So yeah, it's like pretty good, but we're really thinking about it in terms of combo potential. So
okay,
the real question is like, do you replace Pitiless Plunderer with it?
Yeah, I'm gonna go and say that I think it's actually pretty good at parity. I am always surprised with how well Phyrexian Altar performs with tokens. Sure. Because you get to turn them into like mana, and that stacks up so quickly. Like it's crazy.
Better than Phyrexian Altar because it's in the form of a treasure instead of mana.
Yeah, agreed, 100%. And so because I'm always surprised with how Phyrexian Altar does with tokens and being able to just like use that burst of mana, I think I would be surprised at how well this does in a sacrifice deck.
Okay, so I have 2 questions for you. Do you replace Pitiless Plunderer with Warren Soul Trader? In a zombie combo deck.
So I don't have Pitiless Plunderer in a zombie combo deck currently, but if I was doing like an Aristocrats combo style deck,
sure,
I probably wouldn't replace it. I'd probably replace something else.
Both.
Yeah, sure. I think I would. I think it's probably worthwhile running both in a deck.
Would you replace Phyrexian Altar with this card in a black deck?
Probably, because it's a creature.
Yeah,
I feel like
better.
Every time I've drawn Phyrexian Altar, I always actually, even though it's very good, I always kind of feel sad casting it because it's not like there's other things I'd rather do. Right? Exactly. It is purely a combo piece where this is kind of a value engine, right? Because you get treasures rather than just mana.
Yep. Okay. I think it's good.
This is gonna be $90. This is gonna be like Phyrexian Altar. It's gonna be.
I mean, it is $7.
It is $7. I need to buy one really bad.
I know. It's probably, and if it really is better than Phyrexian Arena, it probably just goes up. Or it's, gosh, dang it! Now you have me saying it. Phyrexian Altar.
See,
it probably just keeps going up, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna look at the stocks right now. The stonks of it.
It's at a low.
Get one.
It's not a bad time to buy. Okay, we shouldn't be telling viewers how to spend their money. So
yeah, true. This is not financial advice.
Don't buy it.
Don't buy cards. Don't support Wizards of the Coast. You heard it here first.
Oh gosh, don't.
I'm just kidding. Wizards don't sue us.
Okay, the next card that we're gonna practice evaluating is Kozilek's Unsealing. 2 and a blue for an enchantment. It has Devoid, so the card has no color. That doesn't work for deck building restrictions.
It does not.
Yeah. Okay. Only when you cast it, like only in the deck when you're playing it.
Mm-hmm. So and on the battlefield. Yeah.
And on the battlefield. So whenever you cast, it's an enchantment whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 4, 5, or 6, you create 2 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature tokens with sacrifice this creature, add colorless mana. And whenever you cast a creature spell with mana value 7 or greater, draw 3 cards. Woo!
Pretty sick. Pretty sick card.
That's pretty sweet. It immediately made me think of a card. It made me think of Garruk's Uprising, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. They're both 3-mana enchantments that care about the stats of a creature and can help you draw cards.
Yeah, when I first read this one, that's what I thought too.
Yeah.
And I think I still think that. I think they're like still pretty comparable because there's not something else really to compare this to particularly well.
Yeah, I did think though it was 1-to-1, and as we've discussed this card, it's not 1-to-1. It actually does quite a bit of different stuff.
Yeah, it is significantly different, and it's in blue, which
And it's in blue.
Garruk's Uprising supports green like nothing. Like it's
Sure,
essentially
because
green.
Green
right?
doesn't get a ton of great card draw. This is actually really great card draw. And it gives your creatures trample. So it's drawing you cards for big creatures and making those creatures, evasive, pseudo-evasive.
Yeah, whereas Kozilek's Ceiling is in blue, which is this is a little bit of a strange effect for blue.
Yeah, because we do have like the Simic toughness matters.
Yeah, I think and like mana value 4 or 5 or greater matters. From some recent sets. So I think in Simic, but I would have thought it would be like Simic or like hybrid Simic maybe or something.
Yep.
But the fact that it's in blue, I think makes it just a little bit harder to compare because you're not just slotting this into like an Is It Spellslinger deck because it has to be creature spells with mana value 4, 5, or 6.
Yeah, so I slot Garruk's Uprising into green decks if I need card draw. Because I like it as a card draw engine. I think it's quite good. It's played well for me in that area. I don't think you put this in a blue deck for card draw. Blue has better card draw than this.
You put this in a blue deck that has other things, right? Like with most likely paired with green. In some.
Yeah. But what is interesting is this gives blue acceleration, which is really interesting. Like blue doesn't get, it does get the Scions in the Eldrazi decks, but this triggers not just off of Eldrazi, which is kind of cool.
You get good acceleration, and then you can accelerate from a 4-mana spell to a 6-mana spell. Like a discounted 6-mana spell into a discounted 7-mana spell that draws you 3 cards. So I think it's just a generally a very, very good card, but it is hard to evaluate. This is one that's hard to evaluate because we've not seen anything that's quite like this.
Can I tell you a couple reasons I don't like this card?
Yeah, please.
It doesn't. It only triggers off of cast, so you don't get it from like tokens and things like that. Where Garruk's Uprising is so good because it's just whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield. So you could be blinking creatures, you could be creating tokens. It doesn't work with Kozilek's Unsealing. It only happens when you cast a creature spell with that mana value. It also doesn't give you the initial card draw. Where Garruk's Uprising, when it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you get to draw a card.
Sure.
This one, you play this, you've done nothing. You have to like cast a creature spell for this to do absolutely anything.
Sure. So you're saying Garruk's Uprising, you play this on turn 7 where you already have a creature, at least cantrips. Whereas this one, you just have to play it and you're like, hope you get some value out of it.
Garruk's Uprising, turn 7, you have a big creature. It cantrips and gives the creature trample.
Yeah, that's really good.
Great. Kozilek's Uprising, you draw, or Unsealing, Kozilek's Uprising. Kozilek's Unsealing, you draw turn 7. You've already played all your big creature spells. You play it and you're like, well, hope I draw another one.
Yeah, the casting does make it pretty difficult. I will say, though, on the other side of that coin, I have always found these more frustrating than ETBs to deal with.
Because you get the trigger no matter what.
Because they get the trigger no matter what, right?
Yeah.
Like, they pass priority, this resolves, and they get to cast a spell that is big enough to do this. And so that is, I think, an upside, potentially, right? It's less abusable, but it's more surefire, right?
So go ahead.
I was going to say, what I'm saying right now is I'm excited to actually build my casual Tasigur deck and put this in there.
Yeah, that's sick. Except for you don't get it if you pod for the creatures.
You don't get it if you pod for the creatures.
Yeah.
And Tassigur's only mana value 6, so he doesn't draw you the cards.
But the upside is so much higher. Like, you're creating 2 rectangles that sack for mana, and you get to draw 3 cards if it's a big enough spell.
Yeah.
I guess is pretty good.
It's still pretty good. I think it'll be a fun one to put in there.
I think where I've landed on this, and let's really quickly just look at the quadrant theory. It's obviously good when you're ahead because you're already ahead, except for it doesn't do anything if you already have big creatures. Like, you have to be ahead, and there's a setup cost of being able to cast a big creature spell.
Yeah.
I think it's for that reason, it can be good at parity, and it can be good at developing because it sets you up for bigger turns. It can ramp you.
I think that's when it's best, though, right? Because
I do think it's the best if you're developing.
You're hoping to get it in the first couple turns.
Just hurts so bad to like turn 3 play this and pass, and you've done absolutely nothing. Like, but I guess it feels better the next turn if you cast a 4 mana creature and you get 2 scions. That's pretty good.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah. So I think where I'm at on this card is I don't think it's as good as Garruk's Uprising in the sense that I will slot Garruk's Uprising into most green decks because green decks generally want an effect like Garruk's Uprising, where Kozilek's Unsealing is super narrowly designed for big mana creature decks.
Yeah, you want this in very creature heavy decks for sure.
Yeah.
Which is making me more and more consider making Sidisi not an Umori companion deck.
So that you can run this card.
So I can play this card. Yeah, exactly.
I like it.
Okay, so the next one here is Guide of Souls. This is our white card selection for today. Yeah. So Guide of Souls is 1 white for a 1/2 human cleric at rare. And it says, whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and get an energy counter. So the way energy counters work is they are counters on you. They are a counter on a player. And they are permanently on you until you spend them.
Yep.
And then the next part of this is whenever you attack, you may spend 3 energy counters. When you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on target attacking creature. It becomes an angel in addition to its other types.
So, what card do you immediately think of when you read this card?
Sanctuary Warden.
Yeah. What? You mean Soul Warden?
No, Sanctuary Warden.
Because it's an angel?
No, okay. I now know you mean what card am I comparing this to?
Yeah.
As I was reading this, I was like, holy crap, I want to play a deck with Sanctuary Warden, which is the one that lets you remove counters to draw cards.
That is
cool. The one I think
Can you remove counters from yourself?
No, but
Sanctuary Warden?
No, but you can you remove them from Sanctuary Warden, but you can put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on Sanctuary Warden, and it's just free counters to remove.
Oh, because you can remove the flying counter.
Yeah, it's already all flying.
Okay, that's cool. I see where you're going with that.
Yeah,
yes,
sorry.
What I was asking was what card would you compare this to? And I think the first one is Soul Warden.
Yes.
Which is white mana for a 1/1 human cleric. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. So this is symmetrical where you're drawing cards for any creature entering the drawing cards. Whoa, that would be so good.
That'd be wild.
You're gaining life for any creature entering the battlefield, where Guide of Souls is just when they enter on your side.
Yep.
But obviously with the upside of everything involving energy counters. I think the truest comparison is a Johnny's Welcome, which is a white mana for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. So it's just the first half of Guide of Souls on an enchantment.
Yeah, so this is a strictly better version of a Johnny's Welcome.
Yep.
On a creature. And so I think I think adding the on a creature caveat does mean that it's generally harder to interact with. Like, a Johnny's Welcome doesn't die to a board wipe.
Yep.
But
it also can't be a 3/4 flyer.
Right. No, exactly.
Yeah.
I think I generally think of something being on a body as better, but I also think that is like my limited brain. In Commander, I get more worried about that because of the number of players and the frequency of board wipes, where like enchantments tend to stick around longer, right?
I think that's super true. But this does have a lot of really good stuff going for it. The buff is permanent. I think that's huge. Like the flying counter and the 1/1 counters are permanent. But the question I really have is like, how often do you care about? So it's better than a Johnny's Welcome, except for it's easier to interact with. So let's look at Soul Warden. How often do you care about the other creatures with Soul Warden? And I've actually been thinking about this because I have played Soul Warden in decks. I think there's kind of a couple places to play Soul Warden in decks. For me, the deck that I played it in was a life gain deck. And I wasn't making a ton of tokens or playing a ton of creatures. I just wanted to be gaining life every turn. And I think in that deck, Soul Warden is way better because you're getting that life gain trigger every turn that somebody plays a creature. I think where Guide of Souls is better is if you're playing Soul Warden for your own turns when you're making a bunch of tokens.
Yeah. There are 3 times as many players at the table than there are you. Like,
Yeah.
as many opponents as there are you. And so Soul Warden, I think everyone is playing this type of card that says whenever a creature or whenever a something happens, is always surprised with how often it happens, even though you're not the one doing it.
Yep.
And so you're right. I do feel that in a life gain deck, Soul Warden is probably the one you want. But in a token deck, you're probably way happier with Guide of Souls, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If we look at quadrant theory, I think Guide of Souls is fine when you're ahead. It's good if you're behind, if you can create those tokens yourself to gain the life. It's great at parity because you get to turn potentially something into a big flyer. And then and it's good at developing. If you play this early, you're just at a huge advantage. It's awesome. You're just going to slowly gain that advantage over the course of the game. So, yeah, I think where I finally land on this card is it's probably a better version of existing effects as long as you're in the token deck.
Yeah, I think you need to be making a lot of tokens. You're not just slotting this randomly into a life gain deck.
Yep.
That being said, you probably could, because the upside of giving just one of your creatures +2/+2 and flying
Especially a lifelink creature.
is pretty relevant. Yeah.
That's really good.
That's pretty good. So maybe it does just maybe
Maybe.
you're just putting this in and you're cutting your worst life gain creature, right?
Yeah, maybe. Well, you're definitely cutting your Johnny's Welcome.
Yes, for this. You're cutting your Johnny's Welcome for this. Replace a Johnny's Welcome with this. The next one is one that we had a little bit of a debate about how good it was. And it is one I also want to play in Tasigur because it's sweet. It is Birthing Ritual. So Birthing Ritual is 1 and a green for an enchantment that says, at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature, look at the top 7 cards of your library. Then you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, you may put a creature card with mana value X or less from among those cards onto the battlefield, where X is 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana value. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. That is so much, so let's break it down.
Much. Yeah, so there's actually something that I caught in here reading it this time that I hadn't realized how good it was. But first, let's break it down. So at the end of your turn, if you have creature or creatures on the board, you get to look at the top 7 cards of your library. Already, that's information. That's pretty great. Yeah. Then you can choose to sacrifice one of your creatures. And if you do, you can put a creature card from those 7 cards that you got to look at that has mana value X or less onto the battlefield, where X is 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana value. So it could be an upgrade or it could be a downgrade. And then you put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I have creatures, and in my turn, I could look at the top 7. If I don't see anything I like, I can just put them all on the bottom of my library.
Yeah.
I'm not out anything.
Yep.
Or I can say, hey, I like one of these creatures in here. I'm going to sacrifice a creature that I have to be able to just put that creature onto the battlefield and then put the other 6 cards on the bottom of my library. Can I tell you one thing that I read this time that I hadn't realized before?
Please.
In my mind, I was thinking, I need to target one of my creatures and select one of my creatures to sacrifice before I look at my cards. No. I do not. I can look at my cards and be like, hey, I have a 1 mana, 2 mana, 3 mana, 4 mana creature on the battlefield. And I get to look at the 7 cards and be like, oh, there's a 3 mana creature here. I can sacrifice the 2 mana creature and put the 3 mana creature out. There's so much flexibility there.
Or if you like your 2 mana creature, you can sacrifice your 3 or 4 mana creature and still put out the 3 mana creature.
Yep.
So
there's a ton of flexibility there.
A couple things that make this card, I think, really stand out as potentially being very good is it triggers at your end step, so you don't have to wait till your next turn.
You get it as soon as you play it.
Yep. You look at the top 7 before you sacrifice the creature.
Which you probably hit a creature in 7
Which
cards.
you probably hit a creature. And then you get to choose whether or not you're gonna sacrifice a creature to put whatever creature you find in those 7 on the battlefield.
Yep.
And the fact that it says X or less. I think those 3 things are... So let's compare it to some existing cards and see why that's very good.
Yep.
The 2 things here, there's 3 cards really that we can compare it to. It is Birthing Pod, Eldritch Evolution, and Neoform are kind of the 3 big cards that do the same thing.
So Birthing Pod is 3 and a Phyrexian green mana, so you can either pay green or 2 life for an artifact. Then it has the activated ability 1 and a Phyrexian green mana. Tap, sacrifice a creature. So sacrificing a creature is part of the cost for Birthing Pod. The ability is search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrificed creature's converted mana cost. Put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. You can activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So this is not X or less. This is just like you have to get a creature that costs exactly 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana cost.
Yep. So Let me read Eldritch Evolution. I'm gonna read. I'll read Eldritch Evolution, and then can you read Neoform, and then we can just talk about all three of them.
Absolutely.
So Eldritch Evolution is 1 green for a sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast Eldritch Evolution, sacrifice a creature. So again, part of the cost.
Yep.
Search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, where X is 2 plus the sacrifice creature's converted mana cost. So again, X or less, but this time it's 2 plus the mana value. And you put that card on the battlefield and shuffle your library, and you exile Eldritch Evolution. So one-time effect, you get something X or less. Very cool pod card. And the last pod card is Neoform. Kelso, you read Neoform.
Yeah, Neoform is green and blue for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast a spell, you sacrifice a creature. Search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost equal to 1 plus the sacrifice creature's converted mana cost. Put that card on the battlefield with an additional 1/1/1 counter on it. Then shuffle your library. So there are several things that make this just a very different spell. So Neoform, Birthing Pod, Eldritch Evolution require you to sacrifice the creature first. However, they are tutors, so you get to search for exactly the creature that you're wanting to tutor for. Birthing Pod, you get to look at the top 7
Birthing
first.
Ritual.
Birthing Ritual. You get to look at the top 7 first, then decide if you want to sacrifice the creature. And it's X or less, where Birthing Pod and Neoform are exactly that cost, and Eldritch Evolution is the only one that gives you X or less.
Yep.
Though Eldritch Evolution does give you 1 additional mana's worth of upgrade.
Yep. Yeah. So, okay. I think Birthing Ritual is nuts in a world where you're not tutoring for a specific creature.
Yep.
And here's why I think that way. And it's because I have played CDH and played Eldritch Evolution and played Neoform and played Birthing Pod in my deck and been entirely blown out when I sacrifice a creature and someone counters the spell because I've paid the cost of sacking a creature.
Not for Birthing Pod, for Eldritch Evolution.
For Eldritch Evolution, yes, not for Birthing Pod. But I think the really cool part about Birthing Ritual is that at no point, so even Birthing Pod, someone could like stifle the activated ability, right?
Sure.
Someone could cast a spell to counter the activated ability. With Birthing Ritual, at no point can someone blow you out by stopping you from putting your creature on the battlefield once you've activated your ability. Once the ability has triggered and people have passed priority on it.
Yep. So you said you've played Birthing Pod, Eldritch Evolution, Neoform in CEDH. I think those are CEDH. They're not exclusively CEDH cards. They are obviously CEDH cards. They're also just high power cards. But you're tutoring for something very specific. I do not play those cards in low power decks because generally I'm only wanting to pod, that's the name of that effect, for a very specific card. Birthing Ritual is the super fun, less restrictive, casual version of this effect that you can play, get advantage, and have a ton of fun doing it. I think this card is awesome, but you're not going to see it played in high power decks like you're going to see Birthing Pod and Eldritch Evolution. It's just going to be like the low to mid casual decks that are going to have a ton of fun with this card.
Yeah, this is the one this is another one that I'm really excited to play in Tasigur. I think building it does lend itself to a very casual game because like you're saying, you're tutoring for something very specific, and it's very rare that if I'm playing I think pod effects are very cool.
Yeah.
And if you're playing pod effects casually, it's very rare that you're podding and you're not like, well, I better get the best thing. Like, you're not...
Yeah, because it's either you get the best thing or you spend 10 minutes looking at all the cards in your deck thinking, which card do I want to pod
Yeah,
for?
which one would be fun right now? Yeah. Which is also really fun. But it is like, there's objectively a best thing to choose. And you shouldn't always be playing optimally and doing like the best thing to choose,
it's hard
right?
not to.
But it's hard not to, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard not to feel like you're just sandbagging. Yeah. And that is I think one of my least favorite feelings in Magic is just to be like entirely sandbagging a play versus trying to play optimally under the constraints that I've set for myself. And I think Birthing Ritual allows you to do that very well.
It does that. And the setup cost isn't huge. You just have to have a creature. And it happens on the turn that you play it. So I think that's great. That being said, I don't think it goes in every green deck. I think it could. I think it's playable in most green decks. Most green creature heavy decks, you do have to have like at least 30 creatures in your deck probably to be playing this card. In terms of quadrant theory, it's good when you're ahead. It's good when you're at parity. It's good when you're developing. Like it's okay. It's okay when you're behind as long as you have a creature on the battlefield.
Yeah. And
But-
yeah, you got to be pretty lucky for it to like really get you back into a game from behind, I think.
Yeah, but that'll be a cool story though. When you're
Yeah.
like, oh man, I was so behind, and all I had was this like vanilla 3/3 creature out, and then I birthing ritualed into this crazy card that won me the game. That'll be a cool story. So I do think it is playable in most creature heavy green decks, but it is really at home in Golgari. Like
Yeah.
this is a cool graveyard synergy card where you're
Yes.
sacrificing a creature, putting it into the graveyard to get out another creature that you can then sacrifice to put into your graveyard. It's cool in Marin.
It's pretty sweet. I think
Yeah.
in any Golgari shell, it's going to do really, really well.
Yep.
And I think, again, I'm going to play it in Tasigur. And you know what I just thought of? So tokens obviously have no mana value.
Yeah, but you can get a dork off of them.
You can get a dork off of them. But copies of creatures do
Yes.
have the mana value.
Yep.
So if you play something like Phantasmal Image,
Yeah.
which you have to sacrifice when it becomes the target of anything, but you notably don't target it with Birthing Ritual,
Yep.
like that's pretty sweet because you get a 2-mana creature out that copies someone else's creature, and then you get to cheat out something bigger, which I think is kind of cool.
You know what card or what deck this card is actually crazy in?
Please.
Who's the gingerbread man?
Yes. Oh, the
What's his
Bant
name?
gingerbread guy.
Yeah, what's his name?
Ginger Sculptor. The Ginger Sculptor?
Bernard.
Bernard, the Ginger Sculptor.
Bernard the Ginger Sculptor. Or something like that. Is it not Bernard?
The Ginger. I'm searching right now.
Ginger.
Is
it
it not
is it's Brenard, not Bernard.
Brenard. Oh,
Brenard.
dude.
Yeah, this card's
Dyslexia coming
crazy.
back
So
to bite you.
Bernard is 1 green, white, blue for a 3/3 human artificer. Each creature you control that's a food or a golem gets +2/+2, has trample. Whenever another non-token creature you control dies, so including the one you sacrifice, you can exile it. And if you do, you create a copy that's a token that's a copy of that creature. So it keeps its mana value. It's
That's
so good.
good.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Oh my gosh. This is one that I wanted to build for a little while, and I've forgotten about it, and now I'm
Yeah.
like back on it. That's tight.
Yeah, that's really cool with this card. Okay, sorry. We spent so long talking about Birthing Ritual. I think it's a sweet card. Like I said, I think it's really at home in low to mid casual decks, and it's really, really good in Golgari, but could be played in most green creature heavy decks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Generate the
Very good
last card that we were going to evaluate.
Yes, this is what I'm excited about, and I really want to play. It's called Power Balance. So Power Balance is red for an enchantment at rare, and it says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost if the 2 spells have the same mana value.
Yeah.
Cool card.
This is a cool card, and I think immediately your brain starts to jump to those ceiling best case scenarios where you're like, oh, maybe I have a card on the battlefield that lets me look at the top card of my library so I don't have to reveal the card and I always know what the card is. Or maybe I have top deck manipulation. Maybe I have Sensei's Divining Top and I can just like really curate the top of my deck to make sure it's always going to hit. So I've been trying to evaluate this card with none of that in mind. We have just saying, if I just play this card on turn 2, like, how good is it going to be? And I do nothing to aid it, to help
Yeah.
it perform. How good is it going to be?
But Kelton, what if?
What if? Yeah, so if we're going to look at like similar cards, I think the card that is the closest is a little bit obvious in the sense that it's the mirror of the card, which is Counterbalance. For blue. It's an enchantment that whenever an opponent plays a spell, you may reveal the top card of your library. And if you do, I get to counter the spell if it has the same converted mana cost as the revealed card. So instead of you getting to play the card, you get to counter their card.
Yep. This one, I think
yeah.
what makes me really excited about this is I always thought Counterbalance was very cool. And that's because I was building an Azami Lady of Scrolls mono blue deck. And Counterbalance is a very cool card in that deck because it has so much top deck manipulation.
Yep.
And it's like a relatively expensive card. And so it's like, oh, cool. This card is obviously very sought after.
Yes.
And so you see Power Balance.
Counterbalance is like $13 or something.
Yeah, at one point it was like $25, $30, maybe $40, and it went down after I got a reprint. But a cool card, and so you see Power Balance and you think, ooh, that's like a similar card, and it's letting you actually cast the spell and not just countering their spell, which could mean countering their spell, but also could mean whatever other effect you want, right? And so it is easy to live in magical Christmas land with this one because it's really easy to get excited about what it does.
Yeah, so it has the same cost as Counterbalance. It has, in some ways, the same incidental impact as Counterbalance, except for it's proactive. It's proactive rather than reactive. Like it's helping your game plan instead of stopping someone else's game plan. And just like Counterbalance, it has the ability to really go crazy with tutors and
Yes.
and like top deck manipulation. So I think Counterbalance is a card that's pretty much only played at higher power levels and CDH. Is that a correct
Yeah,
assessment?
and I will say, now that we've been talking about it a little bit, the one difference here is with Counterbalance, if you reveal a top card of your library, say it's like in CDH it'd be like 0/1/2 mana, right?
Yep.
People can continuously cast spells with that mana value, and you will have the same card on top of your library, and it locks people out of casting spells of that mana
Yeah.
value until that card is gone.
Yep.
Which is huge. Whereas with Power Balance, you cast the spell and there's immediately a new spell on top, or a new card on top, right?
Yeah. I also think so. Counterbalance, you reveal the card, and then people say you have a 3 mana card on top of your deck. I'm not going to play my 3 mana spell into it because it would just get countered.
Right.
It like you said, it locks people out of playing those cards. Power Balance, I don't think plays that way. I think players are greedy in where they're like, okay, like yeah, you'll get to cast that spell if I cast this spell. I don't care. I'm trying to do my thing. And so I do think you probably get more casts off of Power Balance than you get counters off of Counterbalance, which is kind of cool.
Which is cool. I will say the other thing with Counterbalance too is that we talked about, I think, the bane of Power Balance being lands, right? Is like not 50% of the time, but pretty close to 50% of the time.
You're going to hit a land.
You're going to hit a land.
Yeah.
And with Counterbalance, especially in higher powers, that's not a big deal because
People
are
are
going to be
paying
casting
0 mana stuff.
Right, exactly. Whereas with
And you
Power
can't
Balance,
cast this. You can't cast
you
a
can't
land
cast
with
a
Power
land.
Balance.
Yeah, so that land is a Bolas Citadel land. It just feels bad that it's on top of your
so
library.
dead.
Right?
Yeah. So I do think this is similar in the sense that it scales with power. Like Power Balance is so much better with tutors. I was reading a thread earlier today where someone was like, okay, someone Force of Wills your thing and you tutor for ad nauseum.
Oh
right?
my gosh.
That's
crazy.
Crazy, right? And so
Yeah.
I do think the ceiling is so high on Power Balance at higher power levels, especially if you have lots of tutors.
Yeah.
Like it gets so good with tutors.
Yeah.
And so I do think it probably is going to fall into a very similar power level as Counterbalance. Like I think you're mostly going to see it in higher power decks and in CDH decks. I don't know if it's CDH viable. I'm not even going to say that you're going to see it in CDH decks.
I don't know that it is or it isn't, but I do think it's probably pretty good in high power where you have the tutors and very good top deck manipulation. That said, I think it also does pretty well in like an Is It Spellslinger deck where you're playing things like Brainstorm and Opt and other things that are scrying or drawing you a card at instant speed and changing the top card of your deck, because if you see it once and it's a land, cool, I'll play a draw spell and see what else I get on top, or put something from my hand on top.
I think this is really good in like Stelloli, the new Outlaws of Thunder Junction commander.
I mean, I'm building an Ovika deck and I'm putting in an Ovika, certainly.
So in Quadrant Theory, this one is so hard to evaluate because you don't know how often it's going to hit. So like if it does hit, it's great when you're ahead, it's great when you're at parity, it's great when you're developing, it's okay when you're behind, but like how often is it really going to hit? And it probably hits by our back of the napkin math 50 to 60% of turn cycles.
Yeah.
Which I think is enough.
Yeah.
I think if you hit 2 out of 3 turn cycles, you're pretty happy.
Yeah, I think this is not going to see any play in Modern, almost guaranteed.
No.
This sees in Commander though, you have 3 opponents. Like in the same way that Soul Warden does better because you're gaining more life. This is giving you more chances for people to cast spells of that mana value, unless there's a land on top, right?
And people want to cast multiple spells a turn.
Right, exactly. So you like Magical Christmas Land, you match every spell someone casts on their turn, right? And you cast like 2 or 3 free spells, which is awesome. I think.
You do really want to build around it in the sense that like top deck manipulation all of a sudden becomes a lot better. Also, you change your play pattern quite a bit, right? Like you're going to keep up fetch lands until you've revealed the top card of your deck and you need to know if you need to shuffle your deck. Like you're going to play very differently with this card.
Yeah, 100%. I also think that in terms of Quadrant Theory, we've talked about it being like depending on like how it hits, right? If it's going to be good in each of those areas, I think the best time that this is where this is best is when you're developing, right? Because you play this early and you have just so many more chances to hit, right?
So that's because turn 2 I want to be playing a Mana Rock usually.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so it's like I play this on turn 2, and I'm like, now I haven't rammed, but
Sure.
my opponent could play a mana rock, and then I have a mana rock on top of my deck, and then I
Right.
rammed for free.
No, I think, like you're
it's
saying,
so, yeah.
it changes your play pattern, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think in our world that we've built of, like, play patterns of we're ramping early and we're, right?
Super consistent.
Super consistent.
Yeah.
I think this card, if you have this in your opening hand and a mana rock, I'm playing this every time.
Really?
Because I have 3 chances to hit a spell off the top, and if I don't, boo-hoo, I just ramp on the next turn. And the decks that I'm playing this in aren't going to really care as much about ramping out and getting a commander out super quickly.
I would say you don't have 3 chances of hitting off the top. You have 1 chance. Because if it's a land, it's the land for the whole turn cycle.
True, yeah. But if it's not a land, you have 3 chances.
Then you have
right?
3 chances,
So
which
you
is
have-
awesome.
so
Which
you
is
have
so
one-
good.
You have 1 chance the first time, and and then you either have no additional chances or 2 additional chances.
Yeah. if
Right
you
at
hit something
minimum,
cheap
right?
every
And
time.
if they're casting 1 spell a turn.
Yeah, so I think this is my pick for the card that's like hardest to evaluate without playing. So I'd say like in order for me to actually evaluate this card, I would need to play with this card. I did play against this at the pre-release, and I had seen this card and automatically thought it was unplayable. I was like, too much chance,
Especially in limited.
especially in limited. I was like, doesn't do anything. It beat me in limited. It was so good. It was so difficult to play around. And I think it was the deck that I was playing against, and my deck had such tight curves where it's like we were playing so much at like 2, 3, and 4 mana, where they revealed like a 3 mana card off the top of their deck, and I was like, if I play my 3 mana spell, I die. Like
Yeah.
they will get to cast that card for free, and it is a card that will end the game for me. And so I was not able to cast spells effectively. It was they hit probably every other turn, which is really good. If you can get 2 activations off of this, I think it's good.
Yeah, I think that there's the differences being in limited, the margins are very thin. Like it's very rare that you're just blowing someone out in limited, and so any sort of advantage piece like this that does hit is really scary. But in commander, you have 2 additional opponents to be able to trigger this, and so I think I agree with you. This is probably the hardest one to evaluate. But also one I'm very excited to try playing in the right deck.
It's so hard. Yeah. I mean, I think if I were to build a limited deck and I had this in my pool, I probably still wouldn't put it in my limited deck.
No,
like,
I don't think I would either.
I think you just play it and then you're like, great, I did absolutely nothing. I just spent a card and paid mana and did absolutely nothing. And there's a chance that I get something from it in the future. And I don't even know if it's going to be something that I want. And yeah, I think it's probably good in Commander. I don't know, man. I can't wait to see it played. This will be a very fun card to see how it actually plays out.
100%. I'm excited to play it.
Well, that's going to be everything for this episode. We hope that you took something from this mess, but we went over quite a few methods for how to evaluate cards. Hopefully, you can use these methods to help you evaluate some of the new cards that come out. We'd love to hear what new cards you're excited about. What cards are you looking at and thinking, hey, that card looks pretty sweet, and I can't wait to put it in my decks. We'd love to hear.
Yeah, or help us feel better by telling us some of the ways you failed evaluating cards.
Yeah, so Spencer's not just feeling bad about the One Ring.
Yeah, exactly. And when a year from now we look at these cards and think, "Oh my gosh, we were so wrong," that we feel a little bit better because there's someone in the comments that also
questioned power balance.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, thank you everyone for listening. We post every week, so please tune in next week. Like and subscribe so you can get notified when we do post. And you can see with the content that we have coming out. We're excited about the content we do every week. We're always looking for suggestions, so we've seen some in the comments. As you've seen, hopefully, we try to be very responsive to those and do episodes that are requested. So please request episodes. We'll make sure we put them into our backlog and hopefully try to do them in the future.
Yep, you can keep finding us on YouTube, Spotify. Hopefully, we'll get on more podcast platforms soon. You can always find us on thecommanderpod.com. That's an easy way to reach out to us. And until next time, remember to always pay the one.